All right, our last example from 14.1 is more of a word problem, an application problem. A little bit more complicated because there's decimals in here, so let's get through it. There's also going to be a separate video showing you how to use your calculator to do some of this stuff so you don't have to do it by hand. Okay, so it says here the US and Canadian exchange rates change daily. The value of the US dollar and Canadian dollars between 2010 and 2014 can be approximated by the function, where t is the number of years since 2010. Based on the model, in what year did the value of the US dollar reach its absolute minimum, and what was the absolute minimum value of that dollar during this period? So I see these keywords here where it asks us to find the absolute minimum of this function. And so we're going to follow the same 3 steps that we did before. We're going to find the derivative, we're going to find the critical numbers, and we're going to evaluate those critical numbers and the endpoints in our original function. Okay? So first thing we need to do is find our derivative. So pause the video, find me the derivative, and see if you got the same number as me. So here's my derivative. Make sure yours looks like mine. Once we find the derivative, we're going to find our critical numbers. Remember, that's where our derivative equals 0 or doesn't exist. So I'm going to set the derivative equal to 0, and I'm going to solve. Here's where this problem gets a little more complicated. Because of all the decimals, it's a little bit harder to solve this problem because it's harder to factor and use the quadratic formula. Now, if you're comfortable using quadratic formula with all these decimals, you can do that. But what I'm going to do is make a separate video showing you how to use your graphing calculator to put this in your calculator, and the calculator will find the zeros for you. Now, I'm only comfortable with the TI, so sorry, Casio people. You might have to Google it or YouTube that. But in this separate video, I'll show you how to take this function, put it in your calculator, and figure out where the zeros are. For right now, I'm just going to talk you through it. And so watch that second video with the calculator and then come back to this and make sure you understand where I got those numbers from, okay? So in my calculator, I figured out that my critical numbers are at 7.22 and 1.72. Now, once I find these critical numbers, remember we're going to take these critical numbers and we're going to plug it into the original problem and the original function. So that's this big craziness up here. Again, I'm going to show you in that video how to take your critical numbers and plug it into the original without having to redo it every single time in your calculator and make a mistake. Okay? But I'm going to take my critical numbers, remember that was the 1.72 and the 7.22, and plug it into that original. But do you notice that I've crossed off the 7.22? Why is that? Well, if you look at the question, it's saying that the parameters, the endpoints really, are between 2010 and 2014. So if t is the number of years since 2010, we're really 2010 we're going to consider 0, and 2014 we're going to consider 4. So really our endpoints are 0 and 4. And my critical number of 7.22 is way outside of that parameter, so I don't really need to worry about that 7.22. I do have to worry about the 1.72, and I do have to worry about those endpoints to see which one is the highest and the lowest. So I'm going to evaluate 0, I'm going to evaluate 1.72, and I'm going to evaluate 4 in my original function to see what those values are. These are the values that I got. Make sure you use your calculator, find those values yourself so you know how to use them for the test day. And now let's figure out where our absolute minimum value was. Well, looking at these 3 values, it looks like our absolute minimum is 0.9851. That happens when x, or t, is 1.72. And so in this scenario, if I were to ask you to give me a sentence interpreting your answer, you would say 1.72 years after 2010, so you could say toward the end of 2011, right? The US dollar was at its absolute minimum, and its absolute minimum value is this 0.99 if you were rounding it because it's money, so about 99 cents, right? $0.99. So 1.72 years after 2010, the US dollar was at its absolute minimum, and that minimum value was 99 cents. Okay, please, please, please make sure you watch that calculator video so that you know how to do all of this in your calculator so you're not having to do it by hand if this were a test question. You will have homework problems like this. I will say though that the test question probably isn't as complicated, but there are still some decimals in there. So please practice this one, practice using your